Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of medieval Europe's most overlooked death traps, the brewery cellar. Picture this, you're standing at the top of narrow stone steps that disappear into absolute darkness below. The air rising from that hole smells like rotting fruit mixed with wet dog and something you can't quite identify but definitely don't want to. Your torch flickers, casting shadows that make the descent look less like stairs and more like a throat swallowing you whole. This is where you'll spend the next 12 to 16 hours of your day, every day, until your body gives out or something down there kills you first. And here's the thing nobody tells you about medieval brewing. The beer might have been safer to drink than the water, but making it was absolutely not safer than anything. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these bedtime stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in northern France, let's say around 1347, just before things get really interesting with that whole plague situation. You've been hired, well, more like conscripted, to work in the cellar beneath the monastery of St. Wandril. The monks up above in their scriptorium are busy copying manuscripts and singing vespers, enjoying what they believe is a contemplative life of spiritual devotion. You, on the other hand, are about to discover that their holy beverage requires some deeply unholy labor. The head brewer, a man named Godefroy who lost 3 fingers to barrel-making accidents and walks with a limp from that time, a cask rolled over his foot, hands you a crude candle stuck in a clay holder. He mutters something in Norman French that you barely understand, but the gesture toward the stairs is universal. Down you go. The first thing that hits you is the temperature drop. Even though it's summer outside, the cellar maintains a constant chill that seeps through your wool tunic like it's made of cobwebs. These stone chambers were built partially underground, sometimes 8 to 10 feet below ground level, specifically to keep temperatures stable for fermentation. The monks didn't understand the science of yeast and temperature relationships, but they'd figured out through trial and error that beer made in cool, dark places tasted better and lasted longer. What they hadn't figured out, or perhaps didn't care about, was that these same conditions were absolutely perfect for cultivating every form of mold, fungus, and respiratory disease known to medieval medicine, which admittedly wasn't saying much. Your eyes adjust slowly. The cellar stretches out before you in a series of vaulted stone chambers, each one supported by thick pillars that glisten with condensation. The floor is uneven. Centuries of foot traffic have worn grooves into the stone, and these channels now carry thin streams of liquid that might be spilled beer, might be groundwater, might be something far worse. You'll learn not to think too hard about it. Godefroy leads you to your station. Historians still argue whether medieval breweries had standardized workspaces or if each operation was improvised chaos, but from where you're standing, it definitely looks like the latter. There's a massive oak barrel, they call it a tun, that's easily 6 feet tall and probably 4 feet in diameter. Your job, Godefroy explains through gestures and the occasional comprehensible word, is to monitor this tun and several others like it during the fermentation process. You peer into the tun. The surface is alive, literally alive. A thick, creamy foam roils and bubbles, occasionally releasing bursts of gas that smell like bread dough having a panic attack. This is the krausen, though nobody here has a word for it yet. What you're watching is millions of yeast cells consuming sugar and excreting alcohol and carbon dioxide. But to you and everyone else in 1347, this is simply God's miracle happening in real time. The monks upstairs genuinely believe they're witnessing a form of divine transformation. They're not entirely wrong, fermentation is pretty miraculous, but they've attributed it to prayer rather than fungus. Your first task is to skim the foam. Godefroy hands you a wooden paddle with a long handle and demonstrates the technique. You sweep the paddle across the surface, collecting the thick head of foam and dumping it into a bucket. This has to be done every few hours to prevent the beer from developing off flavors. But here's where your medieval experience starts differing dramatically from modern craft brewing. That foam is full of wild yeast, bacteria, and occasionally things that died in the beer and floated up. You're not wearing gloves because gloves haven't been invented for this purpose yet. Your hands will be in and out of beer-adjacent substances all day long, and you'll eat your meals with those same hands after maybe rinsing them in a bucket of water that 7 other workers used before you. The next barrel over is making a sound. It's a low gurgling, like someone trying to breathe through mud. You look at Godefroy with alarm, but he just nods. This is normal. This particular ton is further along in fermentation, and the yeast activity has slowed enough that you can hear the individual bubbles rising and popping. Medieval brewers actually used sound as one of their primary diagnostic tools. An experienced cellar worker could walk through in total darkness and tell you which barrels were fermenting properly, which ones were stuck, and which ones had gone bad, all just by listening. You are not an experienced cellar worker. To you, it all sounds vaguely threatening. Godefroy leaves you with a final instruction. Stay awake. Fermentation doesn't sleep, so neither do you. Well, you can sleep a little in shifts on a pile of empty grain sacks in the corner. But someone needs to be monitoring these barrels at all times. A runaway fermentation can cause a barrel to explode. Yes, actually explode with enough force to send oak shrapnel through your body like medieval shrapnel. It doesn't happen often, but not often isn't the same as never. And you'll spend your first few nights jumping at every creak and groan of the wood. You settle into a rhythm. Skim the foam. Listen to the barrels. Walk the perimeter of the cellar with your pathetic little candle, checking for leaks. The moisture down here is unbelievable. The walls sweat constantly, creating a sheen that reflects your candlelight in unsettling ways. The floor is slick with condensation, spilled beer, and biological material you're trying not to identify. Your boots, actually more like leather bags tied around your feet, are soaked within the first hour. They'll stay soaked forever. You'll develop trench foot before trench foot has a name. Around hour 3 of your first shift, you notice the smell changing. At first, it was just yeasty and sour, almost pleasant if you're into that sort of thing. But now there's an undertone of rot, of something organic breaking down in ways it shouldn't. You follow your nose to a barrel in the far corner. The wood is darker here, almost black, and when you touch it, your hand comes away with a substance that's slimy and cold. This is barrel rot, caused by bacteria eating away at the wood itself. The barrel is compromised. The beer inside might already be vinegar. You should probably tell someone, but Godefroy has gone upstairs, and you don't know who else to tell, and honestly, you're not even sure it's your job to report this. So you make a note to mention it later and move on. This right here is how medieval beer quality worked. It was a constant game of catching problems before they catastrophically ruined entire batches. Unlike modern brewing with its temperature controls and sanitation protocols and pure yeast strains, medieval brewing was like trying to conduct an orchestra where half the musicians are actively trying to sabotage the performance and the other half are just really enthusiastic but talentless. You might end up with something drinkable, or you might end up with infected swill that gives the entire monastery dysentery. The odds were honestly not great. You discover the rats around hour 5. Not 1 or 2 rats. A whole society of rats that have built their civilization in the gaps between barrels and inside the walls. They're fat and slow, drunk on the beer they've been lapping up from spills and leaks. One of them locks eyes with you, and for a moment you have the distinct impression it's judging your work performance. Probably has more experience in this cellar than you do. Medieval monasteries and brewing operations had a complicated relationship with rats. On one hand, rats consumed grain stores and contaminated everything they touched. On the other hand, cats weren't always effective at controlling rat populations, and poison was expensive and might contaminate the beer. So workers like you were simply expected to coexist with them perhaps occasionally taking a stick to the bold ones, but mostly just accepting them as colleagues in the brewing process. The candle burns down. You light another from a small cache kept in a niche in the wall. Fire safety in a medieval brewery cellar is a joke, except it's not funny because people died. The combination of wooden barrels, alcohol vapor, open flames, and exhausted workers created conditions where fires could and did break out. The stone construction of the cellar itself helped contain some blazes, but if the fire got into the barrel storage areas, you had a room full of flammable liquid in wooden containers. Your escape route is those same narrow stairs you came down, which can accommodate maybe one person at a time if they're not panicking. You make a mental note of where the stairs are, then realize you're so turned around in this maze of pillars and barrels that you're not actually sure anymore. That's fine. Probably fine. Your back starts hurting. Not the kind of hurt that goes away with stretching, but the deep, structural hurt that signals something is fundamentally wrong with what you're doing to your body. Leaning over these enormous tons, lifting the heavy skimming paddles, walking on uneven stone for hours. None of this is ergonomically sound. Medieval workers in physically demanding jobs typically developed severe skeletal problems by their 30s. Curved spines, destroyed knees, shoulders that ground and clicked with every movement. You're getting a preview of your future, and it hurts. But the beer keeps bubbling. The yeast keeps working. And you keep monitoring because that's the job, and if you don't do it, you don't eat, and possibly you get beaten by Godefroy or whoever's in charge of discipline around here. The economic relationship is clear. Your suffering produces a commodity that makes the monastery wealthy and provides safe drinking liquid for the community. Your individual well-being is not part of the equation. As your first shift stretches toward its conclusion, and by conclusion we mean you're just too exhausted to continue and someone will relieve you eventually, you start to understand the real horror of this job. It's not any single dramatic danger, though those exist. It's the grinding, relentless nature of conditions that slowly destroy you while producing something essential to medieval life. The beer matters more than you do. The beer will outlast you, and when your body finally gives out, someone else will take your place at the paddle, skimming foam in the dark, breathing mold, and wondering how their life led them here. The yeast doesn't care that you're exhausted. It doesn't care that your hands are raw from the wooden paddle, or that you've developed a cough from breathing this fetid air for the past 8 hours. The yeast has one job: consume sugar and make alcohol. And it's doing that job with the enthusiasm of a force of nature that predates human civilization by about 1 billion years. You're just the referee in a biological process you can't see and definitely don't understand. Godefroy returns from whatever he was doing upstairs, probably sleeping in an actual bed, the lucky bastard, and approaches the main fermentation tun with the gravity of a priest approaching an altar, which, in a way, he is. The monastery's entire economy runs on beer. The monks drink it, they sell it to townspeople, they use it to pay workers, and they offer it to visiting nobles and church officials. If this batch goes wrong, it's not just a culinary disappointment, it's a financial catastrophe. And the thing most likely to make it go wrong is invisible. He dips a wooden cup into the fermenting liquid, brings it to his nose, inhales deeply, then takes a small sip. He swishes it around in his mouth with his remaining teeth, maybe 5 or 6 total, and then spits it onto the floor. You watch this diagnostic process with fascination. He's reading the beer the way a scholar might read Latin text, extracting information from sensory input that you can't even begin to interpret. After a moment of contemplation, he grunts something that might be approval or might be resignation. Hard to tell. What Godefroy is actually doing, though he doesn't have the vocabulary to explain it, is assessing yeast health and fermentation progress. The medieval brewer's relationship with yeast was like a marriage arranged by someone else where neither party speaks the same language. They knew that if you saved some of the foamy stuff from one batch and added it to the next batch, fermentation happened more reliably. They called this foam godesgoed in some regions or barm in others, treating it as a gift from heaven rather than a living organism. Louis Pasteur wouldn't explain what yeast actually was until the 1860s, so for the entirety of the medieval period, brewers were essentially conducting advanced microbiology while believing they were performing a combination of cooking and prayer. You're learning to read the foam yourself now, a few days into your new career. The good foam is thick and creamy, with a slightly rocky texture, and it smells aggressively yeasty but not rotten. The bad foam is thin and slimy, sometimes grayish, and smells like death's gym socks. When you see bad foam, it means something else has gotten into the beer, wild bacteria probably, or a strain of yeast that produces off flavors. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers intentionally cultivated multiple yeast strains or simply had no choice but to work with whatever was floating around in the environment. But from your position down here in the trenches, it definitely feels like the latter. The barrel next to you starts hissing. Not the gentle gurgle you've gotten used to, but an actual sustained hiss like an angry cat the size of a horse. You back away slowly, remembering Godefroy's warning about exploding barrels. The pressure building up inside from carbon dioxide production can turn a wooden cask into a bomb. The hoops holding the barrel together, iron bands hammered and riveted by a cooper who probably died decades ago, strain visibly. You can see the wood flexing. "Godefroy!" you shout, your voice cracking with panic. He ambles over with infuriating casualness, looks at the barrel, and then produces a long metal spike from his belt. Before you can process what's happening, he drives the spike into the barrel about 6 inches from the top. There's a sound like a demon exhaling, and a jet of foam and beer shoots out, soaking both of you. The pressure releases, the hissing stops, and Godefroy hammers a wooden peg into the hole he just created. Problem solved, medieval style. You're drenched in fermenting beer, which will dry into a sticky coating that will attract every insect in the cellar. But at least you still have all your limbs. This is your introduction to pressure management. Fermentation produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Lots of it. In a sealed container, that gas has nowhere to go, so pressure builds until something gives. Modern brewers use airlocks and pressure relief valves. Medieval brewers used violence and hope. They'd drill holes, hammer pegs, and occasionally just let barrels explode and clean up the mess afterward. The economic calculation was simple. Losing one barrel in 10 to explosion was cheaper than developing better cooperage technology. The yeast itself is a mystery wrapped in an enigma covered in foam. You watch it work day after day, seeing the surface of the beer change from still liquid to roiling foam to gradually calmer fermentation, and you understand why people thought this was divine intervention. Something invisible is turning sweet grain water into beer. The liquid warms itself through the process. You can feel the heat radiating from an active fermentation if you hold your hand above it. It bubbles and hisses and changes color and aroma, all without any visible agent of change. If you didn't know about yeast, you'd think it was magic too. The medieval understanding of fermentation was tied up with humoral theory and the idea of substances having inherent properties that could be transformed through proper treatment. They believed the grain had a spirit that was being released and transformed through the brewing process. In a way, they weren't completely wrong. There is something almost spiritual about watching a living organism transform one substance into another. They just had the mechanism backwards. It wasn't the grain's spirit. It was billions of tiny fungi eating and pooping. Your least favorite part of the job reveals itself about a week in barrel rotation. The yeast settles. In fact, a thick layer of it accumulates at the bottom of every fermentation vessel, creating a sludge that's part dead yeast cells, part protein matter, part other organic material you don't want to think about. This sediment needs to be separated from the beer, which means you need to transfer the liquid from one barrel to another, leaving the sludge behind. This process is called racking, and it's exactly as fun as it sounds. You and another cellar worker, A guy named Alan, who has the permanent squint of someone who spent too many years in dim light, haul an empty barrel into position next to a full one. These barrels weigh several hundred pounds even when empty, and the floor is slippery with condensation and spilled beer, so you're basically trying to move furniture on an ice rink. You get the empty barrel positioned, then Godefroy hammers a wooden spigot into a hole drilled near the bottom of the full barrel. Beer begins to flow. This is where you learn about siphoning medieval style. There's no pump, no electrical assistance. Gravity does the work, but gravity is slow and patient, and you're trying to transfer 50 gallons of liquid before the next fermentation emergency demands your attention. The beer trickles out at a rate that makes you want to weep. It'll take hours. During those hours, you need to monitor the flow, make sure the receiving barrel doesn't overflow, and prevent contamination from the environment. That last part is nearly impossible in a cellar that's basically a cave full of mold and rat droppings. But you do your best. The sediment left behind in the original barrel is fascinating in a horrifying way. It's several inches thick, brownish gray, and has the consistency of wet cement. This is the trub, though again, nobody here has a word for it. Some of it gets saved to start the next fermentation. That's your go-to-scoot starter culture, full of yeast that's proven it can survive in beer. The rest gets scooped out with bare hands and wooden paddles and dumped into buckets. What happens to it then depends on the monastery's waste management system, which is to say it probably goes into a pit somewhere or gets spread on the fields as fertilizer. Medieval waste management was very much a somewhere else's problem kind of situation. You're elbow deep in yeast sediment when you notice something moving in it. Not the movement of settling material, but actual purposeful movement. A worm. A fat, pale worm that's been living in the trub, eating dead yeast cells, and apparently thriving. You drop the paddle and stumble backwards, nearly knocking over the barrel you just spent 3 hours filling. Godefroy laughs. An actual genuine laugh, the first you've heard from him. Apparently finding worms in the sediment is common enough to be amusing rather than alarming. You decide not to think about how many batches of beer have been fermented in barrels that harbored worms. The answer would not help you sleep. The yeast culture itself, the go-to-scoot that gets passed from batch to batch, is slowly changing over time in ways nobody understands. Each fermentation selects for yeast strains that can survive the specific conditions of this cellar. The temperature, the pH, the competition from other microorganisms. Over generations, the monastery develops its own house strain, distinct from the yeast used by the brewery 2 towns over. This is why beer from different regions tastes different, even when made with similar recipes. The invisible workers are different. Some barrels ferment cleanly. The yeast does its job, consumes the available sugar, and then settles peacefully to the bottom, leaving relatively clear beer above. Other barrels become war zones. Multiple strains of yeast compete with bacteria, each producing different flavors and aromas, some pleasant and some decidedly not. You learn to identify the smell of Acetobacter, the bacteria that turns alcohol into vinegar. Once you smell that sharp, acidic tang, you know the barrel is lost. The beer can't be saved. It'll be dumped or possibly distilled into something even stronger, assuming the monastery has distillation equipment, which most don't yet in 1347. There's a quirky practice you witness one evening that seems particularly mad even by medieval standards. Godefroy brings down a bucket of fresh ox blood from the kitchen. You watch in horror as he pours it into a barrel of beer that's finished fermenting. The blood disperses through the liquid in crimson clouds, and you're certain this is some kind of witchcraft that's going to get everyone burned at the stake. But Godefroy just nods with satisfaction and walks away. What you've just witnessed is an early form of fining using proteins to clarify beer. The blood proteins bind with suspended particles and yeast, forming larger clumps that settle to the bottom more quickly, leaving clearer beer above. Other substances used for this purpose include isinglass, fish bladder, egg whites, and various other organic materials that would make modern vegetarians faint. The practice works, but nobody knows why, which is kind of the theme for medieval brewing in general. They had techniques that were microbiologically sophisticated but zero understanding of the underlying mechanisms. The fermentation schedule dominates your life. New batches start every few days, meaning you've always got barrels at different stages of fermentation requiring different interventions. The fresh batches need constant skimming and monitoring. The middle stage batches need to be checked for stuck fermentation, when the yeast gives up halfway through for reasons nobody understands. The finished batches need to be racked, clarified, and transferred to serving barrels or bottles, except bottles aren't really a thing yet, so mostly barrels. You develop a relationship with the yeast that borders on superstitious. When a fermentation goes well, you try to remember exactly what you did, as if your actions influenced the outcome. Maybe you stirred clockwise instead of counterclockwise. Maybe you said a prayer at the right moment. Maybe the yeast just liked you that day. When a fermentation goes badly, turning out sour or developing off flavors or simply refusing to start, you feel personally responsible, even though you're basically a spectator to a biological process that's been happening since before humans existed. The worst fermentation failure you witness comes in your third week. An entire barrel of beer, 50 gallons of liquid representing weeks of work and significant grain resources, develops an infection that turns it into something that smells like rotting vegetables mixed with sweaty feet. The aroma is so intense it makes your eyes water. Godefroy takes one sniff and his face goes through a journey of emotions. Disappointment, anger, resignation, and finally a kind of grim acceptance. The barrel gets marked for disposal. Months of labor lost to invisible organisms doing what they do. This is the reality of medieval brewing that doesn't make it into the romantic histories. The failure rate was high, really high. Estimates suggest that in monastery breweries, somewhere between 10 and 30% of batches developed problems significant enough to affect quality or salability. Some of that beer still got consumed. Medieval standards for drinkable were considerably lower than modern ones, but it represented lost value and wasted resources in economies that couldn't afford much waste. Your hands are permanently stained now, a yellow-brown color that no amount of washing will remove. The yeast and beer have soaked into your skin, changing its very chemistry. You smell like fermentation all the time, even on the rare occasions when you're allowed upstairs into fresh air. The scent has become part of your identity. People in the monastery town probably recognize you by smell before they see your face. You've become the yeast beast yourself, transformed by daily contact with the invisible forces that turn grain into beer. The barrels own you now. Not metaphorically, you literally spend more time in physical contact with wooden casks than you do sleeping or eating. Your entire existence has become a cycle of rolling, lifting, tilting, tapping, and repairing these massive containers that seem designed specifically to destroy the human spine. Each barrel is a handcrafted monument to medieval cooperage, which sounds romantic until you remember that handcrafted, in this context, means held together by techniques that predate the concept of quality control. The smallest barrels in your cellar, the firkins, hold about 9 gallons and weigh maybe 80 pounds when full. These are the ones you can actually move by yourself without rupturing something internal. The standard barrels, the ones you work with most often, hold around 36 gallons and weigh close to 300 pounds. And then there are the tons, those monsters that gave you nightmares during your first week. A full ton can hold over 200 gallons and weighs approximately, forget about it, pounds. Moving one requires 4 men, 2 wooden levers, prayers to multiple saints, and an acceptance that someone's probably going to get injured. You're learning barrel maintenance through a combination of observation and painful trial and error. The wood is alive in its way. It swells when wet, contracts when dry, and has opinions about how it wants to be treated. Oak is the preferred material because it's strong, relatively watertight when properly maintained, and imparts flavors that actually improve the beer. But oak is also expensive, so many of the barrels in your cellar are made from whatever hardwood the cooper could source. Chestnut, ash, sometimes pine when they were really desperate, which is never a good sign because pine leaks resin into the beer and makes everything taste like a forest floor. The hoops holding the staves together are your constant enemy. These iron bands are hammered into place by coopers who learned their trade through apprenticeships that probably involved frequent beatings and very little actual instruction. The hoops are meant to provide uniform pressure around the barrel's circumference, keeping the wooden staves pressed tightly together so liquids can't escape. In practice, the hoops are always slightly wrong. Too tight and the wood cracks. Too loose and the barrel leaks. The sweet spot is narrow, and entropy is constantly pushing everything toward chaos. You're fixing a leak right now, actually. A barrel that was fine yesterday has developed a steady drip from between two staves about halfway up. In a modern facility, this would be grounds for replacing the barrel or at least professional repair. Here, you just shove a wedge of oakum, basically rope made from old hemp fibers, into the gap and hammer it in with a wooden mallet. The oakum swells when it gets wet, theoretically sealing the leak. Whether it actually works is a matter for future you to worry about. Present you has 17 other problems demanding attention. Barrel rot is the slow nightmare. It starts small, a slightly darker patch on the wood, maybe a faint musty smell that's different from the usual fermentation mustiness. If you catch it early, you can scrape away the affected wood and treat the area with boiling water or, if you're fancy, a salt solution. If you don't catch it early, the rot spreads, compromising the structural integrity of the barrel until one day it just gives way, dumping 50 gallons of beer across the cellar floor and probably onto your feet. You've witnessed this twice now. The sound is spectacular. A sudden crack followed by the roar of liquid and the desperate shouts of workers trying to salvage anything from the disaster. The first time it happened, you just stood there frozen. The second time, you at least had the presence of mind to grab some buckets. The inside of the barrels is supposed to be maintained in a state of relative cleanliness, which is hilarious given that you have no running water, no modern cleaning agents, and no understanding of germ theory. The cleaning process goes like this. After emptying a barrel, you rinse it with cold water if water is available, or beer if it's not, which seems counterproductive, but whatever. Then you scrub the inside with a long-handled brush made from straw or sometimes dried heather. The goal is to remove the layer of yeast sediment and any obvious biological growth. Whether you're actually making anything cleaner or just rearranging the microorganisms is unclear. Some cooperages practice barrel charring, holding fire inside the barrel to lightly burn the interior surface. This actually does reduce bacterial contamination, though nobody knows why. They think it's removing evil humors or making the wood more spiritually pure. In reality, it's creating a layer of carbon that's hostile to some microorganisms while also breaking down some of the wood sugars into compounds that will flavor the beer. Modern bourbon makers still char barrels for similar reasons, except now they understand the chemistry. You just know that charred barrels produce beer that tastes different, usually better, and sometimes the barrel catches fire more thoroughly than intended and you lose the whole thing. The weight of barrel work is destroying your body in ways you can catalog. Your lower back has developed a permanent ache that sharpens into actual pain whenever you bend or twist. Your shoulders click and grind with sounds that seem medically ominous. Your hands have calluses on top of calluses, and several of your fingernails have turned black from being smashed between barrel and stone. Godefroy's missing fingers suddenly make a lot more sense. It's not a matter of if you'll lose a digit, but when and how many. Rolling barrels is an art form that doubles as an extreme sport. The proper technique is to tilt the barrel onto its bottom edge and then walk it forward by rocking it from one edge of the base to the other. An experienced worker can roll a 300-pound barrel across an uneven stone floor with something resembling grace. You are not an experienced worker. Your barrels wobble, veer off course, and occasionally just fall over with a boom that echoes through the cellar and brings Godefroy running to see what you've destroyed now. The worst part is the ramps. Sometimes you need to move barrels between different levels of the cellar, which means rolling them up or down sloped surfaces while preventing them from either gaining momentum and killing someone or simply rolling backwards over your feet. The technique involves a complex dance of leverage, body weight, and wooden chocks that you kick into place at strategic moments. Historians still argue whether medieval cellar workers had formal training for this or just learned through survival bias. The ones who didn't learn fast enough didn't survive to pass on their ignorance. You're helping Alan move a full barrel up a ramp when the whole situation goes sideways. The barrel is heavier than expected. Someone miscalculated the fill level, and about halfway up the incline, you both realize you don't have the strength to complete the move. For a moment, everything hangs in perfect balance. Then physics reasserts its dominance. The barrel starts rolling backwards. You and Alan dive to opposite sides as 300 pounds of oak and beer rumble past, gathering speed, heading directly toward a stack of other barrels that were minding their own business. The collision sounds like a tree falling in a wooden church. The rolling barrel hits the stack, and suddenly you've got 4 barrels in motion, caroming off pillars and walls like the world's most expensive game of billiards. One of them splits along a stave, and beer begins fontaining out. Another tips over completely, its bung popping out and releasing a flood. By the time everything stops moving, you're standing in 3 inches of beer. The cellar smells like a brewery exploded, which essentially just happened, and Godefroy is going to kill you. He doesn't kill you, but the beating you receive is educational. Medieval workplace safety enforcement was direct and physical. You learn, through the application of a wooden rod to your shoulders and back, that barrel security is paramount and that your incompetence has just cost the monastery the equivalent of several months of your wages. You'll be working extra hours to compensate. The fact that you're already working 16-hour days doesn't factor into the calculation. Barrel repairs become your specialty out of necessity. You need to learn cooperage because you keep breaking things. Godefroy, apparently deciding that teaching you is easier than beating you, begins showing you the basics. The wooden staves are held in place by the hoops, but they're also shaped to create a watertight seal. Each stave is slightly curved and beveled along its edges so that when forced together by the hoops, the edges press tightly against their neighbors. When a barrel leaks, it's usually because this seal has failed somewhere. You practice removing and replacing staves on a barrel that's already beyond saving. The process involves loosening the hoops carefully because they're under tension and can spring off with enough force to break bones, and then working the damaged stave free. Shaping a new stave to fit requires tools you barely know how to use. A draw knife, a spokeshave, and a plane. The wood has to be shaped to match the curve of the barrel, and the edges need to be beveled at just the right angle. Your first attempts are disasters. The staves don't fit. They gap at one end or bind at the other. Godefroy watches with the expression of a man reconsidering all his life choices. After a week of practice, you manage to replace the stave in a way that actually holds water. The sense of accomplishment is profound and also depressing, because this is apparently the highlight of your career now, successfully assembling a container. But in the medieval economy, this is a valuable skill. Coopers are relatively well-paid craftsmen, and even basic barrel maintenance knowledge makes you more valuable to the monastery. Your wages might increase from barely enough to avoid starvation to enough to occasionally afford food with flavor. The barrels also require seasonal maintenance. Wood responds to temperature and humidity changes, swelling in wet conditions and contracting in dry ones. During the damp winter months, barrels that were perfectly sound in summer develop leaks as the wood expands unevenly. During the dry summer, barrels contract and the hoops loosen, requiring tightening before the staves separate entirely. This means barrel maintenance is a year-round cycle of adjustments, each season bringing its own challenges. Some of the barrels in this cellar are older than you are. There's one massive tun in the corner that supposedly dates back to the monastery's founding, which would make it over a century old. The wood is dark with age and saturated with decades of beer absorption. It's been repaired so many times that it's questionable whether any original staves remain, like some sort of ship of Theseus situation but with beer containers. The monks treat it with reverence, believing it produces superior beer through some mystical property acquired through age and use. They're not entirely wrong. The barrel's interior has been colonized by generations of yeast and bacteria that form a stable ecosystem producing consistent flavors. But they think it's blessed by God rather than colonized by fungi. You're starting to understand why Godefroy walks with a limp and has missing fingers and generally looks like someone who lost a fight with a wood chipper. Barrel work is violence rendered into occupation. Every day brings new opportunities for crushing injuries, splinters, and impacts. The barrels outweigh you. They're made of materials that splinter and crack unpredictably, and you're expected to maneuver them through confined spaces with inadequate lighting and no safety equipment beyond your own fading sense of self-preservation. The barrel that's slowly killing you right now is a standard cask that developed a crack along one of its staves. Not a leak, an actual structural crack that suggests the wood is failing. This barrel needs to be emptied, broken down, and the stave replaced, which means a full day of heavy labor starting with rolling the barrel to a work area, setting up supports, carefully transferring the beer to another container without introducing contamination, and then beginning the actual repair work. You're on hour 3 of this project, and you've managed to get the beer transferred and the first hoop removed. Only 5 more hoops to go, then the actual repair, then reassembly, then hoping it all works. Your back is screaming. Your hands are bleeding from splinters, and there's still 12 hours left in your shift. But the beer must be contained. The fermentation must be protected. The barrels, despite their tendency to leak, rot, and occasionally explode, remain the only viable storage technology available. So you keep hammering, keep scraping, keep rolling these wooden nightmares around the cellar, knowing that eventually one of them will probably kill you, but hopefully not today. You're standing perfectly still in the middle of the cellar, holding your breath and trying not to die. This isn't metaphorical caution. You've just walked into a pocket of carbon dioxide so concentrated that your next inhale might be your last conscious act for a while, assuming you wake up at all. The air down here isn't just stale or unpleasant. It's actively hostile, a mixture of gases that would make a modern safety inspector simply set the building on fire and start over. The carbon dioxide is invisible, odorless, and heavier than regular air, which means it pools in low spots like water that wants to murder you. Every actively fermenting barrel is exhaling the stuff constantly, hundreds of gallons of CO2 per day across all the tons in the cellar. In a well-ventilated space, this would disperse harmlessly. Your cellar, carved into stone and designed specifically to maintain stable temperatures by limiting air exchange, is the opposite of well-ventilated. The carbon dioxide accumulates in corners, depressions in the floor, and anywhere air circulation is poor, creating invisible death zones that you're expected to navigate by instinct and luck. You learned about the CO2 pockets the hard way, naturally. During your first week, you bent down to pick up a drop tool near the base of a fermentation tun and suddenly felt like someone had wrapped your head in wet wool. Your vision tunneled, your limbs went heavy, and you had just enough functioning brain cells left to stumble backwards before collapsing. Godefroy found you sitting on the floor, gasping like a landed fish, and laughed. "The bad air," he said in his fractured French, gesturing at the floor. "It lives low. You go low, you sleep forever." Historians still argue whether medieval brewers understood that fermentation produced a specific gas or if they just knew empirically that the air near active fermentation was dangerous. But from your perspective on the floor, the distinction seemed academic. Now you've developed a routine. Before bending down anywhere near a fermenting barrel, you wave your hand through the space near the floor. If your hand tingles or feels cold, a sensation caused by the different thermal properties of CO2, rich air, you know to be careful. You've also learned to watch the rats. The rats know about the bad air. A rat that suddenly keels over wasn't poisoned. It walked into a CO2 pocket. If you see a dead rat with no obvious injury, you mark that area as dangerous in your mental map of the cellar. The rats are your canaries, except nobody cares when they die, and also they're drunk most of the time, which complicates the diagnostic process. The air quality is a study in medieval priorities. The monks upstairs need beer, which requires fermentation, which produces carbon dioxide. They could improve ventilation, but that would make temperature control harder and potentially expose the beer to more airborne contaminants. So the economic calculation goes, controlled environment with occasional worker asphyxiation versus less controlled environment with better beer quality consistency. The workers' lungs are not part of the equation. But the carbon dioxide is only the beginning of your respiratory nightmare. The mold situation down here would make a modern remediation specialist weep and then quit their job to become something safer, like a shark dentist. Every surface, walls, ceiling, floor, barrels, is covered in varying species of mold and fungus. The stone walls glisten with it. Long stalactites of fungal growth hang from the vaulted ceiling like biological chandeliers. The wooden barrels sport coats of fuzzy growth in colors ranging from white to green to black to some shades that probably don't have names yet. You're breathing mold spores with every inhalation. Millions of them. They coat your lungs, colonize your sinuses, and generally treat your respiratory system like prime real estate for fungal expansion. The cough you developed in week 1 hasn't gone away. It's gotten worse, actually, evolving from a dry hack into a productive, rattling thing that brings up substances you try not to examine too closely. Everyone who works in the cellar has this cough. It's the soundtrack of the workspace. A chorus of hacking and wheezing that punctuates the gurgling of fermentation. The humidity is its own special torture. The cellar maintains a constant dampness that approaches but never quite reaches saturation. The temperature differential between the cool cellar air and warmer surfaces creates endless condensation. Water beads on every stone, runs down the walls in thin sheets, and drips from the ceiling in a steady patter that sounds almost like rain. Your clothes are permanently damp, never fully drying even when you're working hard enough to generate body heat. The dampness penetrates your skin, makes your joints ache, and creates perfect conditions for all those mold spores to thrive in your lungs. There's a particular species of mold, you don't know its name because mycology won't be invented for several centuries, that grows in thick black patches on the barrels. Godefroy calls it barrel shadow and treats it as an inevitability. You're supposed to scrape it off periodically, but it grows back within days. This black mold releases spores that are particularly aggressive about colonizing human tissue. Several of the older cellar workers have developed chronic respiratory infections that never quite heal. Their immune systems locked in permanent warfare with fungal invaders. You're probably next in line. The ventilation system, such as it exists, consists of a single narrow shaft that rises through the building to a grate somewhere on the roof. This shaft is approximately 18 inches square, partially blocked by centuries of accumulated debris, and represents the cellar's only meaningful connection to fresh air. The draft it provides is theoretical rather than practical. On windy days, you can sometimes feel a slight movement of air near the shaft opening. Most days, the air in the cellar is as still as a tomb's, which is fitting because that's probably what this place will become for you eventually. The smell is layered like some sort of olfactory archaeological dig. At the surface level, you've got the yeasty, bread-like aroma of active fermentation. Pleasant enough if that's all there was. Beneath that, there's the sour tang of spilled beer that's gone vinegary in the cracks between stones. Below that, the musty reek of mold and mildew. And at the foundation of this aromatic nightmare, There's a smell that can only be described as organic decay, the accumulated biological breakdown of everything that's lived and died in this cellar over the decades. Dead rats, bacterial colonies, fungal blooms, and substances you're glad you can't identify. The smell has soaked into your clothes, your hair, your skin. You carry it with you everywhere. People in the town probably smell you coming from several streets away. The temperature regulation that makes this cellar useful for brewing also makes it miserable for humans. The stone walls maintain a constant chill year-round, somewhere around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect for fermentation. Terrible for anyone who has to work here for 16 hours at a stretch. The cold seeps into your bones. Your fingers go numb regularly, making delicate work difficult. Your feet are perpetually cold despite the leather wrappings you use as boots. The only warmth comes from the active fermentation tons, which radiate heat like biological furnaces, creating bizarre temperature gradients where one side of your body is cold and the other is almost warm. You've started to develop what Godefroy calls cellar lung, though he says it with the resignation of someone describing an inevitable outcome rather than a preventable disease. Your breathing has become labored, especially when exerting yourself. Sometimes you wheeze without meaning to. Sometimes you wake up, on those rare occasions when you actually sleep, feeling like someone's pressing a stone slab against your chest. The monastery has no treatment for this beyond prayer and maybe some herbal tea that does nothing. Medieval medicine has theories about balancing humors and using leeches for everything, but nothing that would address the fundamental problem of working in a toxic environment 8 days a week. The lighting situation makes everything worse. Your candle or oil lamp creates a small sphere of illumination that barely pushes back the darkness. Beyond that sphere, the cellar exists as a collection of shadows and sounds, the drip of water, the creak of wood, the scurry of rats, and occasionally something else that you can't identify and probably don't want to. The darkness is oppressive in a way that makes you understand why medieval people were terrified of underground spaces. This feels like a place that exists outside normal reality, governed by different rules and populated by things that don't require light to hunt. The draft from the ventilation shaft occasionally brings something worse than just stale air. Smoke. When the monastery kitchen is cooking, or when they're burning trash, or when someone upstairs lights a fire in the wrong place, smoke gets drawn down into the cellar through some quirk of air pressure. It accumulates in layers, stinging your eyes and making the already difficult breathing situation nearly impossible. You can't leave. The fermentation requires constant monitoring. So you just endure, breathing through a damp cloth held over your face, eyes streaming, while the smoke slowly dissipates over hours. There's a phenomenon that happens sometimes during particularly vigorous fermentation. The entire cellar becomes hazy with what looks like steam but isn't. It's aerosolized beer and yeast, a fine mist of fermentation byproducts that hangs in the air like fog. Breathing this is exactly as pleasant as it sounds. The particles coat the inside of your throat and lungs, and for days afterward, you can taste beer with every breath. Modern brewers would recognize this as a workplace hazard requiring respiratory protection. You just add it to the list of things slowly killing you. The air pressure in the cellar does strange things. Being partially underground with limited ventilation creates a microclimate that doesn't quite match the world above. When storms roll through, you can feel the pressure changes in your ears and sinuses. The barrels respond too. Pressure differentials affect fermentation rates and can cause previously sealed barrels to start leaking or previously leaking barrels to temporarily seal themselves. You've stopped trying to understand the mechanism and just accepted that the cellar has moods influenced by whether you can't see. Your sense of smell has been permanently altered. You've become so accustomed to the cellar's particular bouquet of horrors that you no longer notice it consciously. What you do notice is when you occasionally go upstairs and the fresh air hits you like a slap. Suddenly you realize you've been oxygen deprived for days. Your head clears, your energy returns, and you remember what it feels like to breathe without resistance. Then you have to go back down to the cellar, and the transition is like diving into murky water, except the water is air that wants you dead. Godefroy tells you about a worker from before your time. A man named Piers who went to sleep in the cellar one night during a particularly active fermentation period and never woke up. They found him in the morning, lying peacefully near the base of a tun, killed by carbon dioxide that had pooled around his sleeping spot while he slept. The monastery gave him a funeral and hired someone else. No changes were made to improve ventilation. The economic value of stable fermentation temperatures outweighed the occasional dead worker. You're developing a constant headache that might be from the bad air, the mold spores, the humidity, or some combination of all three. It sits behind your eyes like a dull pressure that never quite goes away. Sometimes it sharpens into actual pain, usually when you've spent too long near actively fermenting tons. The carbon dioxide does something to your blood chemistry. Modern science would explain it's affecting your pH balance, but all you know is that being down here makes your head hurt and your thinking feel sluggish. The worst air events happen during the summer months when fermentation is most vigorous and the cellar is most sealed against warm outside air. The CO2 production reaches peaks that turn the entire cellar into a marginally survivable environment. You work in short shifts during these periods, running up to fresh air every 30 minutes or so, gasping and recovering before diving back into the toxic soup. Productivity drops, which annoys the monks, but even they recognize that dead workers produce no beer at all. You've started having dreams about breathing. Vivid dreams where you're underwater or buried alive or locked in a small box, always suffocating, always desperate for air that won't come. You wake up gasping, and then remember you're still in the cellar, and the air here isn't much better than your nightmares. The line between sleep and waking has become blurry, both states characterized by difficulty breathing and pervasive dampness. The air has weight down here. You can feel it pressing against you, thick with moisture and spores and carbon dioxide and the accumulated exhalations of yeast colonies that outnumber humans by trillions to one. Every breath is work. Your lungs labor against the thickness, extracting what oxygen they can from an atmosphere that's increasingly hostile to human life. But the beer keeps fermenting, the barrels keep filling, and you keep breathing for now because that's the job, and if you can't do it, someone else will take your place and breathe this poison air until it kills them too. The first rat introduces itself by running across your foot while you're bent over a barrel, both hands occupied with a skimming paddle. You feel the weight and the scrape of claws through your thin leather boots, and by the time your brain processes what just happened, the rat has vanished into the shadows between two casks. Welcome to your new roommates. There are hundreds of them down here, possibly thousands, and they've been living in this cellar far longer than you have. They're not intimidated by your presence. If anything, you're the intruder in their well-established civilization. Medieval rats were different beasts from their modern descendants. These are ratus, black rats, larger and more aggressive than the brown rats that would eventually replace them. An adult male can be a foot long, not counting the tail, which adds another 8 or 9 inches of muscular, naked appendage that looks disturbingly like a pink whip. They're sleek, fast, intelligent, and utterly fearless about humans who work slowly in poorly lit spaces. They've learned that cellar workers are more likely to ignore them than attack them, mostly because you're too exhausted to care and also because the rats outnumber you significantly. The rats are thriving down here for obvious reasons. Grain is stored in sacks that inevitably develop holes. Spilled beer creates puddles of high-calorie liquid that the rats lap up with enthusiasm. The constant temperature and darkness provide ideal nesting conditions, and the total lack of effective pest control means they can breed without meaningful interference. A female rat can produce 5 litters per year, with up to 12 pups per litter. Do the math on exponential growth in a protected environment and you understand why you're not alone down here. You're learning to identify the rats individually, which is a sign that you've been in this cellar too long and your mind is seeking companionship wherever it can find it. There's the big gray-brown male, probably the patriarch of several family groups, who has a notched ear from some past fight. He owns the northeast corner of the cellar and appears nightly to patrol his territory. There's a smaller, quicker female who's missing part of her tail and specializes in stealing from the grain sacks. And there's what you've started calling the drunk rat, who seems to have figured out how to tap the slowest barrel leak and spends most of his time visibly intoxicated, stumbling around and occasionally falling over. The rats have highways through the cellar, specific routes they travel between nesting areas and food sources. You can see their paths in the dust and grime on the floor, smooth tracks worn by thousands of tiny feet over months or years. These highways run along walls, behind barrels, through gaps in the stonework that you didn't know existed until you saw rats disappearing into them. The architecture of the cellar includes a whole secondary structure, the rat infrastructure, that's as complex as anything the human builders created. The nesting areas are somewhere in the walls, you think, or perhaps in the spaces between the cellar ceiling and the floor of the rooms above. You hear scratching and squeaking from inside the stones sometimes, muffled sounds of rat domesticity happening in cavities you can't access. Occasionally, you find evidence of nests in storage areas, shredded cloth, bits of straw, and other scavenged materials formed into surprisingly sophisticated structures. The rats are better at creating comfortable living spaces than you are. The real problem with the rats isn't their presence. You've almost gotten used to that. It's the contamination. Rats urinate constantly, marking territory and leaving scent trails. Their droppings accumulate everywhere. On barrel tops, in grain sacks, along walkways, and inevitably in and around the beer-making equipment. Medieval sanitation standards were not rigorous, but even by those relaxed standards, the amount of rat waste you're working around is spectacular. Every surface you touch has probably been in contact with rat excrement at some point. You've stopped thinking about it because thinking about it would make the work impossible. The monastery employs exactly one cat for pest control in a cellar that probably contains hundreds of rats. Her name is something you can't pronounce. Godefroy calls her Merd, which you're fairly certain means shit, and she is profoundly uninterested in doing her job. She's a fat, lazy mouser who has apparently reached a détente with the rat population. She catches the sick and stupid ones, which the rats don't miss, and in exchange, the rats don't gang up on her, which they absolutely could do. You've seen her sleeping peacefully while rats walk past her at a distance of maybe 3 feet. She doesn't even open her eyes. Some nights, when fermentation activity is high and the rats are particularly bold, you hear them fighting. Rat combat sounds like small children screaming mixed with the tearing of cloth. 2 males will square off over territory or breeding rights, rearing up on hind legs and going at each other with teeth and claws. The fights are brief but vicious. The loser, if it survives, retreats to lick its wounds. The winner marks the disputed territory with urine and possibly some blood that's not its own. You try not to walk through these battleground areas, though in the dark it's often impossible to tell where they are. The drunk rats are your favorite discovery, if favorite is the right word for something deeply unsettling. Multiple rats have figured out that beer is both accessible and intoxicating. They seek out leaks, spills, and improperly sealed barrels. After consuming enough alcohol, they exhibit all the signs of mammalian drunkenness: impaired coordination, reduced fear response, and poor decision-making. You've watched a drunk rat try to climb a wall 3 times, fail 3 times, and then apparently give up on ambition altogether and take a nap in the middle of the floor. It would be funny if it weren't also a reminder that you're working in conditions that get rodents drunk accidentally. The water situation makes everything worse. The cellar has no drainage system beyond. Eventually it seeps into the ground, which means any liquid spilled down here just sits until it evaporates or soaks into the porous stone. Given the humidity level, evaporation is slow. So you're walking through pools of water that might be fresh groundwater seepage, might be condensation, might be spilled beer, or might be rat urine. Probably it's a combination of all four. Your feet are constantly wet, which means your leather footwear is slowly rotting and your actual feet are developing problems that medieval medicine has names for but no solutions to. The monastery's sewage system, such as it exists, runs through pipes in the walls, terracotta or wooden channels that carry waste from the upper floors to a cesspit somewhere outside. These pipes leak. Of course they leak. Medieval plumbing leaked like a drunk telling secrets. You've traced several mysterious wet patches on the cellar walls to sewage seepage from the pipes above. The stone is stained brown and yellow, and the smell in these areas goes beyond the usual cellar funk into territories that make you gag even after weeks of acclimation. The rats don't mind. They treat sewage leaks as bonus amenities, lapping up whatever comes through. There's a particular corner of the cellar that everyone avoids when possible. The floor there is always wet, not with clean water but with something dark and viscous that no amount of scrubbing will remove. It stains the stone black and smells like death's bathroom. You're fairly certain it's the drainage point for multiple problems. Sewage leaks, barrel overflow, and possibly something else you don't want to identify. The rats have built a major nest near this area, suggesting they find the conditions ideal, which tells you everything about rat aesthetic preferences. Flooding happens seasonally. During heavy rains, groundwater rises and seeps through the foundation stones. The cellar floor becomes a shallow lake, sometimes several inches deep, forcing you to work while wading through cold, filthy water. The barrels sit partially submerged. The rats retreat to higher ground, perching on barrel tops and watching you work from their temporary islands. The flooding ruins grain stores, promotes mold growth, and generally makes an already miserable workplace exponentially worse. But the beer must be made, so you wade through medieval soup and try not to think about what's soaking through your disintegrating footwear. Historians still argue whether medieval breweries had any waterproofing technology or just accepted flooding as inevitable, but from your waterlogged position, it definitely feels like the latter. No one seems surprised by the floods. Godefroy just sighs and points to the brooms, indicating you should sweep the water toward the lowest point of the floor where it will presumably drain into the earth or the afterlife or wherever medieval cellar water goes. The sweeping accomplishes almost nothing, but it gives you something to do besides stand in water and contemplate your life choices. The rats are getting bolder. One of them, not the drunk one, a different, more ambitious individual, has started stealing food from workers. You had a piece of bread, the first food you'd eaten in maybe 8 hours, and you set it down for just a moment to deal with a barrel emergency. When you turned back, the bread was gone and a rat was disappearing into the shadows with something suspiciously bread-sized in its mouth. You were too tired to be angry. The rat probably needed it more than you did anyway. You're both just trying to survive the cellar. The disease vector aspect of the rats is something nobody discusses, but everyone understands on some level. Rats carry fleas. Fleas carry plague. It's 1347, and the Black Death is currently making its way across Europe, though it hasn't reached this region yet. When it does, and it will in about a year, the monastery's rat population will be instrumental in spreading it. But right now, you're just worried about more immediate rat-related problems. Bites, contamination, and the way they sometimes get into grain supplies and die there, decomposing into the raw materials for beer. You found a dead rat in a grain sack last week. Not on top, where you might notice before using the grain, but buried several inches deep, suggesting it had burrowed in to eat and then died from overindulgence or perhaps from alcohol poisoning after eating grain that was still carrying residual beer from a previous batch. By the time you discovered it, the decomposition process was well advanced. The smell was remarkable. The grain was supposedly discarded, though you have suspicions about whether it actually was, given the monastery's waste-nothing philosophy and the fact that brewing would probably kill most pathogens anyway, right? Right? The rats have learned your schedule. They know when you're most likely to be distracted or exhausted. During the middle of your long shifts, when your attention is focused on monitoring fermentation and your reactions are slowed by fatigue, the rats become more brazen. They walk past you at distances of just a few feet. They investigate your workspace while you're still in it. One particularly bold individual has started climbing on barrels you're actively working on, apparently hoping you'll spill something he can consume. You've named him Bastard. And the two of you have developed a relationship based on mutual irritation and grudging respect. The filth is cumulative. Every day adds more rat droppings, more spills, more organic material breaking down in corners you can't reach or can reach but don't have time to clean. The monastery's cleaning schedule for the cellar appears to be eventually or possibly never. You sweep sometimes, when you have a spare moment between crises, pushing accumulated debris toward the walls where it joins the archaeological layers of previous neglect. The floor is no longer the color of stone. It's the color of everything that's ever been spilled or excreted on it, a patina of filth that probably adds structural integrity at this point. Your clothing is permanently stained with substances you can't and don't want to identify. The wool tunic you wear has absorbed so much cellar environment that it's become part of the ecosystem. You've noticed small fungi growing in the damp folds. Your trousers are stiff with dried beer and other materials. You smell like a combination of fermentation, mold, rat urine, and despair. The other workers smell identical, creating a collective miasma that probably violates several laws of nature. The cold water that does manage to seep into the cellar is your only washing resource, and you use it sparingly because it's also needed for brewing operations. You splash your face and hands occasionally, more as ritual than effective hygiene. The water is so cold it makes your teeth ache. It doesn't really clean anything, just rearranges the dirt and leaves you wet, which in the cellar's humidity means you'll stay damp for hours, providing fresh opportunities for mold growth on your skin. The flooding has subsided to its usual ankle-deep puddles, but the rats have returned to ground level, reasserting their control over the territory they temporarily abandoned. They're everywhere again, rustling in the dark, squeaking their communications, and living their rat lives parallel to your human suffering. You've stopped trying to scare them away. They'll just come back. This is their cellar as much as yours. More theirs, really. They're better adapted to it. They'll be here long after you've died of whatever cellar-related disease eventually takes you. The rats are winning, have always been winning, and treating this as some kind of contest was your first mistake. You're trying to cool a barrel of freshly mashed wort, the sweet liquid that will become beer once yeast enters the equation. And the medieval temperature control system is exactly as sophisticated as you'd expect, which is to say it's barely controlled chaos with occasional prayer. The wort needs to drop from boiling temperature to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit before you can add the yeast, or you'll literally cook the yeast to death and end up with sweet grain water that will never ferment. In a modern brewery, this process takes maybe an hour with a heat exchanger. In your cellar in 1347, it takes all night and involves techniques that would make a health inspector simply lie down and weep. The primary cooling method is wait and hope. You've poured the boiling wort into a shallow wooden trough, basically a hollowed-out log that's been sitting in this cellar since before you were born, accumulating character and bacteria in equal measure. The wort steams in the trough, releasing clouds of moist heat that add to the cellar's already oppressive humidity. Your job is to monitor it, occasionally stirring it to promote heat dissipation, and somehow judge when it's reached the right temperature for yeast addition. Temperature measurement is accomplished through the ancient and scientifically rigorous method of stick your finger in it. Godefroy demonstrated the technique on your first day. Dip a finger in the wort, hold it there for a count of 3, and assess the heat level through nerve endings that presumably have been calibrated through years of experience and burns. If you can keep your finger in comfortably, it's cool enough. If you have to pull it out immediately, it's still too hot. If it's somewhere in between, you use your judgment, which is another way of saying you guess and hope for the best. The consequences of getting this wrong are severe. Add yeast to too hot wort and you kill it, wasting the yeast starter that took days to cultivate and leaving you with a barrel of liquid that will spoil before you can attempt fermentation again. Add yeast to too cold wort and fermentation might start but proceed sluggishly, creating opportunities for contamination by bacteria that work at lower temperatures than yeast. The window of correct temperature is maybe 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and your measurement tool is a finger that's currently numb from cold, scarred from burns, and generally unreliable as a precision instrument. You've developed supplementary techniques. Watching the steam pattern helps. When the wort stops actively steaming but still releases occasional wisps, it's getting close. Observing how quickly condensation forms on the wooden sides of the trough provides clues. And there's a strange folk method that Godefroy swears by. He tosses in a small piece of bread and watches how fast it sinks. Apparently, the bread sinks at different rates depending on temperature and sugar content, creating a kind of biological thermometer. You're skeptical but willing to try anything that doesn't involve more finger burning. Winter brewing is its own nightmare. The cellar temperature drops to the point where fermentation becomes sluggish or stops entirely. Yeast is less active in the cold, which means longer fermentation times, which means more opportunity for things to go wrong. The solution is to warm the cellar, which sounds simple until you remember that you're in a stone chamber underground with minimal ventilation and your heating options are fire and more fire. The heating system consists of braziers, metal bowls filled with burning charcoal positioned strategically around the cellar to raise the ambient temperature. This creates multiple new problems. First, fire safety. You're introducing open flames into a space containing alcohol vapor, wooden barrels, and exhausted workers who might accidentally back into a brazier. Second, air quality. Burning charcoal produces carbon monoxide, adding another toxic gas to the already impressive collection of respiratory hazards. Third, temperature control. The braziers create hot spots near themselves while leaving distant corners cold, resulting in temperature gradients that make consistent fermentation basically impossible. You're tending a brazier right now, actually feeding it small pieces of charcoal while trying not to asphyxiate from the smoke. The charcoal is expensive. The monastery has to purchase it from charcoal makers who harvest and process wood specifically for this purpose, so you're not supposed to waste it. But you're also supposed to keep the cellar warm enough for fermentation. These two directives are often in conflict, and you're the one stuck making judgment calls that will either waste money or ruin beer, both of which result in beatings from Godefroy. The smoke from the braziers has nowhere to go. Remember that single inadequate ventilation shaft? It can't handle the volume of smoke produced by 6 or 8 braziers burning simultaneously. The smoke accumulates in layers, creating a haze that makes the already poor visibility even worse. Your eyes stream constantly, your throat burns, and the irony is that you're introducing smoke inhalation to solve the cold temperature problem, trading one health hazard for another because medieval workplace safety is based on the principle of pick your poison, literally. Summer presents the opposite problem. The cellar's natural cooling is insufficient during heat waves, and fermentation runs too hot, producing off flavors and sometimes causing the yeast to produce fusel alcohols that make the beer taste like solvent and give everyone who drinks it a catastrophic hangover. Your cooling options are limited. You can't refrigerate. Refrigeration won't be invented for centuries. You can't even make ice easily, because ice harvesting and storage is expensive and mostly reserved for food preservation and medical use, not beer cooling. The primary summer cooling strategy is suffer and produce inferior beer. You drape wet cloths over barrels, hoping evaporative cooling will lower the temperature by a few degrees. It maybe works a little, hard to say. The cloths need to be re-wetted constantly, adding to your task list. And where does the water come from? That questionable cellar water source that might be groundwater seepage, might be condensation, might be something worse. You're putting it on barrels of fermenting beer. Quality control is more of an aspiration than a practice. There's a theory among some brewers that fermenting beer in contact with cold stone will help temperature regulation. So some barrels are positioned directly against the cellar walls, maximizing stone contact. This works, except the walls are also where mold growth is most aggressive and where sewage seepage is most common. So you're trading temperature control for increased contamination risk. Again, medieval brewing is just an endless series of choosing which disaster you prefer. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers understood that fermentation temperature affected flavor, or if they just knew that beer made in summer tasted different from beer made in winter and accepted it as God's will. From your position in the cellar, dealing with the daily reality of temperature management with tools that haven't been invented yet, you suspect it's more the latter. The monks upstairs probably theorize about heavenly influences and the position of stars. You know it's because it's fucking hot down here and the yeast is freaking out. The risk of fire is constant and terrifying. You've got open flames, wooden barrels, alcohol vapor, and structural timber all in close proximity. The monastery has experienced cellar fires before. You've seen the charred sections of wall where previous blazes were contained. The firefighting equipment consists of buckets of water and the hope that people notice the fire before it becomes unstoppable. The buckets are often empty because the water was needed for brewing. Your survival plan in case of fire is basically run toward the stairs and hope you're not the slowest person in the cellar. One of the braziers tips over during your shift. You're not sure how, maybe you bumped it, maybe a rat knocked into its base, maybe it just decided this was a good time to fall over. Burning charcoal spills across the stone floor, rolling toward a stack of wooden grain sacks. You react with a speed you didn't know you possessed, grabbing the nearest bucket. Fortunately, this one has water in it, and dumping it on the coals. The resulting steam cloud adds burns from steam to the list of hazards you've faced today. The coals hiss and smoke, but don't ignite anything major. You've just saved the monastery from a catastrophic fire, and your reward is that no one will ever know because preventing disasters isn't as visible as causing them. The temperature swings between day and night are enough to affect fermentation even in the supposedly stable cellar environment. During the day, heat from the monastery's activities, cooking, forge work, human body heat, seeps down into the cellar, raising temperatures by a few degrees. At night, everything cools. The barrels respond to these fluctuations. Wood expands and contracts. The beer inside heats and cools. The yeast speeds up and slows down. You're trying to maintain a consistent process in an environment that's fundamentally inconsistent. You've burned yourself again. It's become so routine that you barely register it anymore. This time it was splashback from adding cold water to a too-hot batch of wort, creating a burst of steam that caught your forearm. The skin is red and already blistering. Medieval burn treatment consists of maybe putting some butter on it if butter is available, which it's not, or possibly applying a poultice of herbs that someone thinks might help, or just ignoring it until it either heals or gets infected. You choose option 3 because you don't have time for the other options. Your hands are a map of burn scars at this point. Small circular marks from embers that popped out of braziers. Longer burns from grabbing hot metal tools without thinking. A particularly nasty scar on your palm from that time you tried to judge wort temperature and misjudged badly. The scars are sort of a badge of experience, except they're also permanent tissue damage that's reduced your manual dexterity and probably given you chronic pain that will worsen as you age, assuming you live long enough to age. The frostbite is a winter-specific bonus. The combination of wet conditions and cold temperatures creates perfect conditions for freezing tissue damage. Your feet are the primary victims. Constantly wet from wading through cellar puddles, exposed to temperatures just above freezing, never properly drying. You've lost feeling in 3 toes on your left foot. The skin there has turned grayish and hard. This might improve when weather warms, or those toes might be dead tissue now, just waiting for infection to set in so you can experience the medieval amputation process. Time will tell. You're stirring a batch of wort, trying to promote even cooling, when you realize the stirring paddle is starting to smolder. You've been holding it too close to a brazier and the dry wood has begun to char. You drop it quickly, but not before inhaling smoke from burning wood plus whatever bacterial colonies were living on the paddle. The paddle itself is probably ruined, which means Godefroy will be angry, which means another beating, which means just another day in paradise. The thermal properties of wood are working against you constantly. Wood is an excellent insulator, which is great for maintaining temperature stability in a barrel over time, but terrible when you're trying to cool something quickly. A barrel full of hot wort will hold that heat for hours, slowly radiating it into the surrounding air while the stone walls weep with condensation, and your desperate stirring accomplishes almost nothing. You understand now why commercial brewing eventually moved to metal containers. Temperature control would be so much more manageable. But metal is expensive, specialized metalworking is rare, and tradition dictates wooden barrels, so wooden barrels it is. There's a technique for emergency cooling that borders on insane. Some brewers will add cold water directly to the hot wort, diluting it to bring down the temperature faster. This requires calculating the dilution ratio to ensure the final beer still has the right gravity, the sugar concentration that determines alcohol content. Medieval brewers did this math without Arabic numerals, spreadsheets, or hydrometers, relying instead on experience and prayers to patron saints of brewing. The results were inconsistent, sometimes producing beer that was too weak, too strong, or just strange. But when you needed to cool wort quickly before bacterial contamination set in, dilution was faster than waiting. You're watching a barrel sweat in the summer heat, condensation running down its sides like tears, and you understand why the monks pray over the brewing process. It's not that prayer helps, though who knows, maybe it does, but that the process is so dependent on factors outside your control that prayer is the only remaining option. You've done everything the medieval brewing manual, which exists only as oral tradition and Godefroy's cryptic gestures, tells you to do. Now you wait and hope the temperature cooperates. The yeast survives, and nothing catches fire. The brazier near you has burned down to coals. You need to add more charcoal, but the supply bucket is empty, which means a trip up to the storage area, which means stairs, which means you're screaming back and these get to experience new varieties of pain. The temperature management never stops. The fire must be fed. The cooling must be monitored. The beer must be maintained within a temperature range you can barely measure and certainly can't control with any precision. And if you fail, if the temperature drifts too far in either direction, you waste resources the monastery can't afford to waste, and your body pays the price through violence from supervisors who see you as less valuable than the beer you're making. Your body is failing in ways that would be alarming if you had the energy to be alarmed. 3 months into this job, and you've developed a comprehensive catalog of injuries, diseases, and chronic conditions that would take a modern medical textbook several chapters to properly document. Your back, which used to be a functional part of your skeletal system, is now a source of constant grinding pain that radiates from your lower spine up through your shoulders. The pain has become such a constant companion that you've stopped thinking of it as pain and started thinking of it as just what existing feels like now. The spinal damage is biomechanically inevitable. You spend your days bent over barrels, lifting objects that weigh more than you do, and working on uneven stone floors that provide no support. Your spine is compressing, the discs between vertebrae slowly flattening under the constant stress. Medieval workers in physically demanding jobs typically developed severe kyphosis, a curved spine that bent them forward into a permanent hunch. You're seeing the early stages of this in your posture. When you try to stand fully upright now, something in your back grinds and clicks, and the pain intensifies. So you don't stand fully upright anymore. You adopt the slightly forward slouch of someone whose skeleton is surrendering to gravity and labor. Your hands are perhaps the most visibly damaged part of your body. The skin is cracked and bleeding from constant exposure to beer, water, and the caustic cleaning solutions made from lye and wood ash. The cracks are deep enough that you can see pink tissue beneath, and they never heal because they never get a chance to. Every time you plunge your hands into another barrel or grip another wooden tool, you reopen the wounds. Some of the cracks have become infected. You can tell by the redness and the way they've started producing pus. Medieval medicine has no antibiotics, so infected wounds either heal on their own or progress to something worse. You're hoping for the former but expecting the latter. The joint problems are setting in early. Your knees, subjected to constant climbing of stairs while carrying heavy loads, have developed a chronic inflammation that makes every step a negotiation between movement and pain. They swell visibly by the end of each shift, the skin tight and warm to the touch. Sometimes they lock up entirely, refusing to bend until you force them, producing a crack that echoes through the cellar and feels like something fundamental breaking inside your body. Godefroy's limp is your future. You're just a few years behind him on the same deterioration timeline. The respiratory disease you've developed has progressed beyond a simple cough into something more ominous. You're producing thick, discolored sputum that you try not to examine too closely. Your breathing makes sounds, wheezes and rattles, that weren't there 3 months ago. Physical exertion leaves you gasping, bent over with your hands on your knees, trying to force air into lungs that seem to be losing their capacity. This is some combination of mold exposure, toxic gas inhalation, and chronic dampness, creating the perfect conditions for fungal colonization of your respiratory system. Medieval physicians would diagnose this as an imbalance of phlegmatic humors and possibly prescribe bloodletting, which would make everything worse while accomplishing nothing helpful. The malnutrition is subtle but pervasive. Your diet consists primarily of bread, thin soup, and whatever beer is considered too low quality for sale but adequate for worker consumption. You're getting enough calories to not starve, barely, but you're deficient in virtually every vitamin and mineral humans need to maintain health. Your gums bleed when you eat, a sign of scurvy from lack of vitamin C. Your vision has become slightly blurry, possibly from vitamin A deficiency. You've got a tremor in your hands that might be from B vitamin deficiency, or might be from neurological damage from alcohol consumption, or might be from some combination of malnutrition and toxic exposure. Historians still argue whether medieval workers were generally malnourished or if their diets were more varied than records suggest. But from your position at the bottom of the monastery's social hierarchy, eating whatever gets thrown your way, it definitely feels like the former. The monks upstairs eat meat, cheese, fresh vegetables from the monastery garden, and drink the good beer. You eat carbohydrates and sadness. The nutritional disparity is literally visible in the body types. The monks are generally robust, while you and the other cellar workers are becoming thin and stringy, muscles wasting away despite the physical labor because you're not getting enough protein to maintain muscle mass. The skin infections are everywhere. Your feet, constantly wet from cellar puddles, have developed what's probably athlete's foot, though that term won't be invented for centuries. The skin between your toes is white, macerated, and peeling. It itches constantly and sometimes burns. Your groin area has a similar fungal infection from wearing damp clothing. Your armpits are raw from friction and sweat and the general impossibility of staying clean while working 16-hour shifts in an underground fungus factory. You smell like a corpse that someone tried to marinate in beer. Other workers smell identical. You've all achieved a kind of olfactory equilibrium where nobody's nose works well enough to notice how bad everyone else smells. The dental problems are accelerating. You've lost a molar. It simply fell out one day while you were eating bread, leaving a bloody gap and a lot of pain. The remaining teeth are loose in their sockets, a combination of gum disease and scurvy weakening the connective tissue. Several teeth have visible cavities, dark holes that hurt when you consume anything cold or sweet. Medieval dentistry consists of extraction without anesthesia, performed by whoever in the community has the strongest hands and least squeamishness about making people scream. You're avoiding that fate as long as possible, which means living with increasing dental pain and the knowledge that infection from bad teeth can spread to your jaw, your brain, and kill you in ways that are both slow and agonizing. You've developed anemia from a combination of poor diet, intestinal parasites, and possibly chronic low-level blood loss from all those skin cracks and injuries. You're tired all the time. Not just the tiredness of long work hours, but a deeper exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. Your skin has taken on a grayish pallor. You get dizzy when standing up quickly. Your heart pounds from minor exertion. Pre-modern anemia was common among working-class people and contributed to the general impression that peasants and laborers were weak and lazy, when in reality they were struggling with serious nutritional deficiencies while performing back-breaking labor. The vision problems are getting worse. The constant work in dim lighting has strained your eyes to the point where everything's slightly blurry, even in good light when you occasionally see it. You're probably developing cataracts early, a common problem for people who work by candlelight and firelight. Your eyes water constantly from smoke and mold irritation. You've got a permanent redness to the whites of your eyes that makes you look diseased or drunk, which is fitting because you probably are both. The parasites are inevitable in this environment. You've got intestinal worms, because you've seen them in your stool, which is as horrifying as it sounds. These worms are consuming a portion of whatever nutrients you manage to ingest, contributing to your malnutrition. Medieval deworming treatments include consuming various herbs, some of which work and some of which are just unpleasant to eat. You haven't been offered treatment because worker health isn't a priority, and also because everyone assumes everyone has worms, so it's not even considered a treatable condition so much as a fact of life. Your immune system is compromised from the combination of malnutrition, chronic stress, toxic exposure, and constant contact with pathogens. You catch every cold, every cough, every minor infection that circulates through the monastery community. These illnesses hit you harder and last longer than they would in a healthy person. You're currently nursing a head cold that's produced enough mucus to fill several buckets and made your already difficult breathing even worse. Nobody cares. You still have to work. The beer doesn't ferment itself. The chronic pain has become your baseline existence. Your back hurts. Your knees hurt. Your hands hurt. Your chest hurts from coughing. Your head hurts from toxic gas exposure and chronic sinus infections. Your teeth hurt. Your feet hurt from standing on stone for hours. Everything hurts all the time, and you no longer remember what it felt like to have a body that just worked without complaint. You've aged a decade in 3 months, your face gaunt and lined, your movements stiff and careful like someone 3 times your actual age. The sleep deprivation is its own form of torture. You work 16-hour shifts with maybe 4 hours of sleep between them, if you're lucky. The sleep you get is on a pile of grain sacks in the corner of the cellar, so it's cold, damp, uncomfortable, and frequently interrupted by work emergencies or rats running across your face. This chronic sleep deprivation affects every system in your body: cognitive function, immune response, healing capacity, emotional regulation. You're operating in a permanent state of exhaustion that makes everything harder and every problem seem insurmountable. The repetitive stress injuries are accumulating. Your right shoulder, which does most of the work of stirring and skimming, has developed a grinding sensation and limited range of motion. Your wrists hurt constantly from gripping tools. Your elbows have a deep, aching pain that suggests tendon damage. These are injuries that need rest to heal, but rest isn't an option. You work through the pain, making the damage worse, creating a cycle that will eventually leave you crippled and unable to perform even basic tasks. There's a worker named Claude who was here before you arrived. You've heard about him from the others. He lasted 5 years in the cellar before his body completely gave out. His back went first, leaving him unable to lift anything. Then a barrel fell on his foot, crushing it badly enough that infection set in. The monastery let him go because he couldn't work anymore. You don't know what happened to him after that. In medieval society, a disabled person with no family support and no ability to work had limited options, none of them good. This is your potential future. Work until your body fails, then get discarded like a broken tool. The cuts and bruises are constant. You're covered in them at various stages of healing, a living timeline of recent injuries. The bruises bloom in spectacular colors: purple, green, yellow, as your damaged capillaries leak blood under the skin. The cuts are from splinters, from sharp edges on tools, from slipping on wet stone and catching yourself on rough walls. Most of them are minor individually, but collectively they represent a body under constant assault with no opportunity for recovery. Your feet are perhaps the worst casualty. Constantly wet, they've developed not just fungal infections but also a condition that's probably trench foot, though the trenches haven't been invented yet for it to be named after. The skin is white, wrinkled, and starting to break down. You can peel away sheets of dead tissue. The smell is remarkable. The pain is intense when you try to walk after sitting for a while, as if your feet need to be reminded how to feet before they'll cooperate. Medieval footwear was not designed for wet working conditions, and your leather boots have basically dissolved into organic material that's neither shoe nor completely not shoe. The mental health effects are harder to quantify but no less real. You're developing what modern medicine might call depression and anxiety, though medieval medicine would call it melancholic humors, and treat with more bloodletting. You have no hope of improvement. Every day is the same suffering. Your future is visible in Godefroy's damaged body and Claude's disappearance. You're trapped in a cycle of labor that's destroying you for the benefit of producing a commodity you rarely get to enjoy. The psychological weight of this combines with the physical pain to create a crushing burden that makes simply continuing to exist feel like an accomplishment. You're coughing up blood now. Not a lot, just flecks mixed with the usual mucus, but enough to know that something in your lungs has progressed from irritated to damaged to actively failing. This could be tuberculosis, which was rampant in medieval populations. Could be a fungal infection reaching advanced stages. Could be lung tissue simply breaking down from toxic exposure. You don't tell anyone because telling someone would mean acknowledging it's happening, and you're not ready to face what that acknowledgement implies about your remaining lifespan. The average life expectancy for a medieval laborer was somewhere in the 30s, not because people couldn't live longer but because working conditions and living standards made longer survival unlikely. You're watching that statistic become personal, feeling your body accumulate damage faster than it can repair, approaching the point where one more injury or illness will tip you from struggling survival into death. And the beer keeps fermenting, the barrels keep needing attention, and your body keeps breaking down in service of an economy that values the product more than the producer. You're technically a free man, not a serf, which means you're legally permitted to leave this job anytime you want. This freedom is theoretical in the way that you're also technically free to flap your arms and fly to the moon. The economic reality is that you're trapped as surely as if you wore chains, bound by a combination of debt, lack of alternatives, and a social system designed to extract maximum labor from bodies at minimum cost. Your wages are paid partially in beer. Not good beer, the thin, sour stuff that didn't meet quality standards for sale, and partially in food that's barely adequate to sustain you, and partially in actual coins so infrequently that you've started to suspect the monetary portion might be theoretical. When you do receive coins, they're deducted against your account at the monastery, which includes charges for your workspace, your tools, your sleeping corner, and various other expenses you didn't agree to but are apparently obligated to pay. The accounting is done by a monk upstairs who you've never met and who certainly has no incentive to calculate in your favor. You're perpetually in debt, always owing more than you earn, trapped in a cycle that medieval economists would later call wage slavery, and modern economists would call exactly what it sounds like. Godefroy occupies a strange position in this hierarchy. He's senior to you but still a worker, making him middle management in a system where management means enforcing discipline through violence while also being subject to violence from above. When the abbot is displeased with production, Godefroy gets beaten. Godefroy then distributes this beating downward to you and the other cellar workers, maintaining the sacred tradition of shit rolling downhill. He has slightly more authority and slightly better wages, which he's earned through decades of surviving work that killed others. You're not sure whether to see him as an oppressor or a fellow victim. Probably he's both. The monastery views you as a tool that happens to require food. This isn't metaphorical, you're literally listed in the same accounting ledgers as the barrels, the copper brewing kettle, and the grain stores. When you wear out or break, you'll be replaced with another human tool, acquired from the same pool of desperate poor people who have no better options. The monastery is a business enterprise that happens to include a church, and you're a line item in the production costs, valued somewhere between negligible and less than the beer. The beating you received last week for the barrel incident has left bruises that are still visible, purple and yellow across your shoulders and back. This is standard workplace discipline. You damaged property, so you received correction. The correction was proportional, in Godefroy's view, to the economic loss. If you'd caused more damage, the beating would have been worse. If you'd caused less, it might have been lighter, or possibly just threats and intimidation instead of actual violence. This is how labor relations work when one party has all the power and the other party has only a body that's becoming less valuable by the day. There's no appeals process, no labor protections, no concept of worker rights. If Godefroy beats you, you accept it or leave, and leaving means starvation because there are no other jobs available in the area, or at least none that you're qualified for, and qualification is determined by birth and social class more than ability. You were born into the class of people who work with their bodies until their bodies fail. Complaining about working conditions is like complaining about weather, acknowledged as unpleasant but fundamentally unchangeable. The other workers in the cellar are your competition as much as your colleagues. There are always more desperate people than there are jobs, which means the monastery can replace you instantly if you become troublesome. This knowledge keeps everyone compliant and prevents collective action. You don't organize for better conditions because organizing means being identified as a troublemaker and being replaced with someone more desperate and less demanding. The system is designed to prevent solidarity, keeping workers isolated and competing for scraps. Historians still argue whether medieval workers had any form of collective bargaining power or if the guild system provided protection for laborers, but from your position as an unskilled brewery worker, the answer is definitely no. Guilds protect skilled craftsmen, coopers, blacksmiths, masons. They don't protect people whose job is lift heavy things in the dark until you die. You're the expendable labor that supports the skilled trades, visible only when you fail, replaceable at will. The abbot visits the cellar maybe once a year, descending the stairs with a cloth held over his nose to filter the stench, examining the production facilities like a landlord inspecting property. He doesn't speak to you directly. That would require acknowledging you as a person rather than an animate tool. He speaks to Godefroy, asking questions about production volumes and spoilage rates and fermentation schedules. You're part of the equipment he's reviewing, as relevant to the conversation as the barrels. When he leaves, you feel a combination of relief and something darker, the knowledge that to the people who control your life, you're fundamentally invisible except as a production statistic. The wage theft is casual and constant. Hours worked are rounded down. Quality of beer provided as payment is suspiciously poor even by low standards. The bread that's part of your compensation is often moldy or stale. When you point out discrepancies, you're told the accounting is correct and questioning it further might result in termination. You learn to accept being cheated because fighting it costs more than the theft itself. This is how the powerful stay powerful. Death by 1,000 economic cuts, each too small to fight individually, collectively draining everything from those who have nothing. There's a concept in medieval law called just price. The idea that goods should be sold at a fair value that allows the producer to make reasonable profit without exploitation. This concept applies to the beer being sold to townspeople. It does not apply to your labor. Your labor is valued at whatever the monastery can get away with paying, which trends asymptotically towards zero. The beer has rights. You don't. Medieval economics protected commodities better than it protected people. You've witnessed a worker get fired for theft. He was caught drinking beer that wasn't designated for worker consumption, better beer, the kind meant for sale. The punishment was immediate termination, no final wages paid, and a beating severe enough to leave him unable to walk properly. The message was clear. The beer is more valuable than you are, and stealing it is stealing from your betters, which is one of the worst crimes in a society built on rigid hierarchy. You learn that your hunger is less important than commodity preservation. The monastery has a complex legal relationship with the local lord and the church hierarchy, with obligations and protections that trickle down through various levels of authority. None of this trickles down to you. You exist outside the protection of feudal obligation because you're not bound to the land as a serf would be. You're free labor, which paradoxically means you have fewer protections than someone who's literally owned. A lord has an incentive to keep his serfs alive because they're property with value. You can be discarded without loss. The social stigma of your job is palpable when you occasionally venture into the town. People avoid you not just because you smell like a fermentation accident, but because brewery cellar workers occupy a low rung on the social ladder. You're associated with drunkenness, filth, and the kind of desperation that takes a job everyone knows is killing you. Parents use you as a cautionary tale. Behave, learn a trade, or you'll end up like that cellar worker who can barely walk upright anymore. You're a moral lesson in physical form. The impossibility of advancement is quietly crushing. There's no promotion structure beyond the possibility of becoming Godefroy someday, surviving long enough to be slightly less abused while abusing others. There's no learning a skilled trade from this position because you don't have time, money, or energy for apprenticeship. You're locked in place, and the only movement is downward as your body fails. Medieval social mobility was essentially zero for the lower classes. You'll die in approximately the same economic position you were born into, possibly lower if the injuries get bad enough. The monastery profits enormously from beer production. The margins are substantial. Grain is relatively cheap when purchased in bulk. The labor costs are minimal because you're paid almost nothing, and beer sells at prices that make the operation very lucrative. This profit goes to expanding the monastery, supporting the monks' relatively comfortable lifestyle, and furthering the church's influence. None of it comes back to you in the form of better working conditions, safety improvements, or living wages. The wealth you create flows upward and stays there. You're not allowed to drink the good beer. This is explicit policy. The beer you helped make, monitored through fermentation, protected from spoilage, and packaged for sale, you'll never taste it. You get the failures, the batches that didn't quite work, the stuff too poor for paying customers but adequate for human tools who should be grateful for anything. Sometimes you sneak sips of the good beer when no one's watching, and the difference is stark. It's actually pleasant. It tastes like something people might enjoy rather than something people choke down for calories. This tiny rebellion is the closest you get to dignity. The punishment for serious infractions, like falling asleep on watch and letting a fermentation run wild, or damaging equipment through negligence, can include public humiliation. You've seen a worker placed in stocks in the monastery courtyard for a day, displayed as an example of failed responsibility. The monks and townspeople walk past, some throwing rotten vegetables, most just staring with a mixture of pity and contempt. The humiliation is the point. The message is, you are nothing, you are replaceable, and your failure is entertainment for your betters. The monastery has the legal right to physically restrain you if you try to leave while in debt. Debt bondage is technically illegal in some regions by this period, but enforcement is selective and favors creditors over debtors. If you tried to run, they could pursue legal remedy that might include imprisonment, forced labor to pay the debt, or physical punishment. Your freedom is conditional on meeting obligations that have been structured to be unmeetable. It's a trap with legal documentation. You've learned to make yourself small and quiet around authority figures. Eye contact with the abbot or senior monks would be seen as presumptuous. Speaking without being addressed first would be insolent. Defending yourself when accused of errors would be argumentative. The proper posture for someone of your class is subservience bordering on invisibility. Present when needed, transparent when not, always aware that you exist at the pleasure of people who could destroy you casually. This psychological subordination is as much a part of your job as the physical labor. The other workers are in the same situation, but there's no solidarity. You're competing for the least bad sleeping spots, the slightly less moldy food, the rare words of approval from Godefroy that might mean marginally better treatment. The system has made you rivals instead of allies, too desperate and exhausted to organize, too aware that any troublemaker will be replaced immediately. This isolation is strategic. A united workforce could demand changes. An atomized workforce just survives day to day, accepting conditions because the alternative is starvation. There's a grim arithmetic to your existence. The monastery makes perhaps 50 times in profit what they pay you in compensation. Your labor creates enormous value. You receive almost none of it. The difference is extracted as surplus, funding an institution that sees you as simultaneously essential and worthless. Essential because someone has to do this work, worthless because anybody could do it and bodies are abundant. You're interchangeable parts in a production process that will continue long after you're dead, with your replacement already being born into poverty that will eventually drive them to this same cellar. The legal system is not designed to protect you. Courts favor property owners, church institutions, and established authority. If you were injured due to monastery negligence, which happens constantly, you'd have no recourse. If you were cheated on wages, which you certainly are, no magistrate would hear your complaint against church property. If you were beaten so severely that you died, which happened to that worker nobody talks about, it would be investigated as a workplace accident, not murder, and result in no punishment. Justice is a privilege of class, and your class doesn't have it. You're slowly understanding that this isn't a job. It's a mechanism for converting human life into profit, operating at maximum efficiency by extracting everything from bodies before discarding them. The beer is just the excuse. The real product is the systematic transformation of your health, youth, and potential into coins in the monastery treasury. And the truly terrifying part is that this is considered normal, moral, even divinely ordained. The social order requires some people to suffer so others can prosper, and you drew the short lot in the cosmic lottery. Despite everything, the pain, the exploitation, the slow-motion bodily destruction, the beer matters, not in some romantic craft beverage appreciation way, but in a fundamental survival of medieval society way that makes your suffering somehow necessary, which is either deeply meaningful or deeply tragic depending on your perspective at any given moment. The beer you're making down here in conditions that would horrify any modern safety inspector is quite literally keeping people alive. This doesn't make your situation better, but it does make it comprehensible within the logic of a world where clean water is a luxury and waterborne disease is a leading cause of death. The water situation in medieval towns and monasteries was catastrophic. Rivers and wells were contaminated with human waste, animal waste, industrial runoff from tanneries and dye makers, and decomposing organic material. Drinking water straight from these sources was playing disease roulette. You might be fine, or you might contract dysentery, cholera, typhoid, or any number of other delightful conditions that would kill you through dehydration and intestinal destruction. People knew empirically that water could make you sick, even if they didn't understand germ theory. The solution they'd arrived at was drink beer instead. The brewing process, particularly the boiling phase, killed most pathogens in the water. The alcohol content, even in the weak, small beer that constituted most daily consumption, created an environment hostile to many bacteria, and the slight acidity from fermentation provided additional protection. Beer wasn't just a beverage, it was water purification technology that happened to produce a mildly intoxicating product as a side effect. Everyone drank it. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Monks drank it for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and as a between meals refreshment. The monastery probably consumed several hundred gallons per week just for its own population. Your daily suffering is producing a public health intervention. The beer that comes out of this cellar, even the mediocre, barely palatable beer, is safer to drink than the water from the local well. This keeps the monastery population alive and relatively healthy compared to communities that rely more heavily on water. It also supports the local economy, since beer is sold to townspeople who need the same protection from waterborne disease. The monastery's brewing operation is essentially running a medieval water treatment facility that happens to produce a commodity they can sell for profit. The caloric content of beer was also significant in a society where food scarcity was common and diets were often inadequate. Beer provided easily digestible calories from the residual sugars and carbohydrates. For laborers working physically demanding jobs, people like you, ironically, beer was a calorie source that could be consumed throughout the day. The beer for breakfast tradition wasn't about medieval people being alcoholics. It was about getting energy into bodies that were about to spend 12 hours doing manual labor. A gallon of small beer might contain 400 to 500 calories, a meaningful supplement to a diet that was otherwise grain-heavy and nutrient-poor. The monastery's economic stability depended on beer production. The profits funded everything else: supporting the monks, maintaining the buildings, copying manuscripts, providing charity to the poor, and exercising political influence. The church's power in medieval society was partly spiritual and partly economic, and beer money was a significant economic pillar. Your labor down here in the dark was funding illuminated manuscripts being created upstairs in the scriptorium. The suffering and the beauty existed in the same institution, connected by economics you were part of but didn't benefit from. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood they were treating water through brewing or if they just knew that beer made them less sick than water, but the practical outcome was the same. Communities with strong brewing traditions, whether commercial, monastic, or household-based, had better health outcomes than communities without. The Black Death, when it arrives next year, will kill indiscriminately, but populations with consistent access to beer rather than water will have marginally better survival rates because they'll be starting from a healthier baseline. Your awful job is, in a roundabout way, plague preparation. The beer also served social functions that helped communities cohere. It was consumed at celebrations, used to seal business deals, offered to guests as hospitality, and distributed as wages to workers. Beer was a social lubricant in the literal and figurative sense. It facilitated human interaction and helped create the bonds that held medieval society together. The monastery used beer as both a product and a tool, maintaining relationships with local nobility, church hierarchy, and the common people through strategic distribution and sale. You were producing a social technology as much as a beverage. The seasonal brewing calendar aligned with agricultural cycles. Spring and fall were peak brewing seasons, after grain harvests when raw materials were abundant and before consumption would outpace production. Your hellish work intensified during these periods, with multiple batches fermenting simultaneously and basically no rest between tasks. But this timing meant beer was available when communities needed it most, during winter when food was scarce and water sources were most contaminated, and during summer when agricultural labor was most demanding and caloric needs were highest. The diversity of beer styles, even in this single monastery cellar, reflected attempts to optimize for different needs. Strong beer with higher alcohol content stored longer and was reserved for special occasions or sale to wealthy customers. Weak beer was for daily consumption. Spiced beer had medicinal properties, real or imagined. Different recipes used different grains based on availability: barley, wheat, oats, sometimes rye, creating products that varied in nutrition and flavor. The experimentation happening in cellars like yours was a kind of distributed research and development program, slowly improving brewing technology through trial, error, and the occasional worker death. The monastery's charity work included beer distribution. During famines or crop failures, they distribute weak beer to the poor as a survival resource. This was both genuine charity and political calculation. A monastery that helped feed people during crisis earned loyalty and influence. Your labor was, occasionally, keeping desperate people from dying of thirst or starvation. This doesn't make up for your exploitation, but it does mean your suffering wasn't entirely meaningless. The beer had positive externalities even if you weren't seeing them. The knowledge being accumulated through brewing, even without understanding the underlying science, was valuable and would eventually contribute to human understanding of fermentation, preservation, and food safety. Every successful batch taught brewers something about what worked. Every failure taught them what to avoid. This empirical knowledge accumulated over generations, passed down through oral tradition and hands-on training, creating expertise that would eventually bridge to scientific understanding. You were participating in a very slow scientific process, though you'd never know it and wouldn't benefit from it. The beer also had diplomatic value. The monastery sent gifts of their best beer to bishops, nobles, and other monasteries as part of maintaining relationships. These gifts communicated quality, wealth, and attention to craft. The reputation of the monastery's beer reflected on the institution's overall competence and standing. Your work in the cellar affected the monastery's political position in ways that rippled far beyond beer consumption. A particularly good batch might influence a bishop's decision about monastery funding. A bad batch might embarrass the abbot during a noble's visit. The stakes were higher than just beverage production. The medical uses of beer were also significant, though many were based more on hope than effectiveness. Beer was used to wash wounds. The alcohol provided some antiseptic effect, even if medieval practitioners didn't know why. It was administered to patients with various ailments on the theory that the nutrition would help. Herbal beers included ingredients thought to have healing properties. Whether any of this actually worked is debatable, but in an era where medical options were limited and often harmful, beer-based treatments were at least unlikely to make things worse, which put them ahead of many alternatives like mercury treatments or enthusiastic bloodletting. The employment your job provided, horrible as it was, represented one of the few available economic options for people without land or skills. The monastery employed dozens of workers directly and supported many more indirectly through purchasing grain, wood, barrels, and other supplies. The beer economy created a network of livelihoods that kept people from absolute destitution. You were exploited, certainly, but the alternative to exploitation wasn't freedom and prosperity. It was probably starvation or banditry. The medieval economy offered terrible choices, and you'd chosen the one that came with regular meals, even if those meals barely sustained you. The continuity of brewing through crisis was also significant. When plague hit, when wars disrupted trade, when harvests failed, the monastery continued brewing because communities needed beer to survive. The institutional stability of the church meant brewing operations persisted even when individual workers, like you probably soon, died or became incapacitated. The system was designed to be resilient at the institutional level, even if it was brutal at the individual level. Your replaceability was part of what made the system work long-term, which is a deeply uncomfortable truth. The technical knowledge required for brewing was preserving and advancing human capability in food production. The same principles that made beer, controlled fermentation, preservation, storage, applied to other foods. Cheese making, bread making, pickling, and other preservation techniques shared underlying mechanisms with brewing. The expertise concentrated in monastery breweries contributed to broader food technology that helped medieval populations survive lean times. Your daily work was part of a larger knowledge ecosystem, even if you'd never see it that way. The beer justified the cellar itself, this underground space that was terrible for humans but excellent for fermentation. Without the economic value of beer production, there'd be no reason to maintain this nightmare space. But because beer was so important, the cellar continued to operate, employing workers, producing revenue, and serving its function in the medieval economy. The fact that it destroyed workers was unfortunate but acceptable within a system that prioritized production over people. You were experiencing the dark side of something genuinely necessary. As you stand here in the dampness and the dark, monitoring yet another barrel of fermenting liquid, coughing up substances that suggest your lungs are gradually failing, you can hold two truths simultaneously. This job is killing you, and this job is keeping others alive. The beer matters. Your suffering produces something valuable. Whether that meaning is sufficient compensation for the destruction of your body and the theft of your potential is a philosophical question you're too exhausted to properly consider. But in the moments when you're not actively in pain, when a fermentation is going well and the cellar is relatively calm, you can understand, however briefly, that you're part of something larger than yourself, even if that something is eating you alive to sustain itself. The monastery bell rings somewhere far above, marking another hour, another segment of your endless shift. The yeast keeps working, converting sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide with the blind efficiency of 1 billion years of evolutionary refinement. The beer will be ready in a few days. It will be consumed, providing hydration and calories and social cohesion to people who'll never think about the conditions under which it was made. And you'll still be here, in the dark, in the damp, in the cold, serving the process that serves the community that views you as expendable. The beer matters, and that's the whole tragedy. The cellar is quiet now except for the gentle gurgle of fermentation, the drip of condensation, and your labored breathing that has become the soundtrack of your existence. Your body hurts in ways you've stopped cataloging. Your future is visible in Godefroy's damaged limbs and missing fingers. Your past is already fading. You can barely remember what it felt like to have a body that worked without pain. There's only the present. This barrel, this task, this moment of monitoring a biological process that predates humanity and will continue long after you're gone. You're so tired. Not just physically, though your muscles shake with exhaustion. Not just mentally, though your thoughts are slow and muddy. You're tired in some deeper way that might be your soul recognizing that this isn't sustainable, that something's going to break soon, that you can't keep doing this much longer. But you can keep doing it today, and probably tomorrow, and the day after, until you can't, and then someone else will take your place at the barrel, and the beer will keep fermenting, and life will continue for everyone except you. The beer matters. It's the only thing that makes sense of this. If the beer didn't matter, if it was just another commodity easily replaced, then your suffering would be purely wasteful. But because it matters, because it's keeping people alive and communities functioning and society operating, your pain has purpose. That purpose doesn't make the pain hurt less. It doesn't make the exploitation just. It doesn't compensate for what's being taken from you. But it means you're not suffering for nothing. In the medieval moral universe, that's probably supposed to be enough. It isn't, but you're not sure anyone cares what you think about adequacy of compensation. Your breathing is easier now, or maybe you're just used to the bad air. The barrel in front of you is approaching the end of active fermentation. The foam has settled, the liquid is clearing, and soon it will be ready to rack into serving barrels. Another batch completed. Another small victory against contamination and spoilage and the general entropy that wants to turn everything into vinegar. You've made beer. It will sustain life. Tomorrow you'll make more. This is the work. This is the meaning. This is all there is. The fermentation slows further as your thoughts begin to drift like yeast settling to the bottom of a barrel. The darkness of the cellar seems less oppressive now, more like a blanket than a threat. Your breathing synchronizes with the gentle bubble and pop of the beer, a rhythm that's almost soothing if you let yourself sink into it. You find yourself remembering something from before the cellar. Sunlight, maybe, or the taste of fresh bread that wasn't stale or moldy. The memory is soft around the edges, dissolving even as you try to hold it. It doesn't matter much anyway. The present is this cool stone, this quiet space, this moment of rest between tasks that stretched into something longer and more forgiving. The barrels around you seem almost companionable now, like sleeping animals breathing slowly in the dark. They're doing their work without complaint, transforming one substance into another through processes older than cathedrals, older than kingdoms, older than the idea of beer itself. You're part of that ancient cycle, your brief human life intersecting with something timeless. There's a strange comfort in that continuity. Your eyes are heavy. The stone floor doesn't seem as hard as it did earlier. The dampness feels less like invasion and more like embrace. The cellar is telling you something in its language of drips and creaks and distant fermentation sounds. That it's okay to stop, that you've done enough for today, that rest is earned and necessary in waiting. The beer will keep. The yeast knows what to do. The monastery will wake tomorrow and continue its routines. And you'll be here, or somewhere, part of the cycle or released from it. But either way, finally, blessedly at peace in the darkness that no longer frightens you but instead invites you into its quiet depths where nothing hurts and everything is still and the long day's work has finally, gently, reached its natural end. Sleep well. You've earned it. End of script. Sweet dreams.